Beyond the gate, spoilers tease that Derek is hiding a secret. The words landed like a cigarette drop on a polished floor's mill. Slick, dangerous. They slipped into conversations, threaded themselves through texts and half-heard phone calls until they unfurled into the quiet rooms of Ashley's life. At first she treated them like gossip, the sort of throwaway thing people said when they wanted to feel they possessed knowledge. But secrets are persistent. They grow teeth. They find ways to gnaw at the edges of ordinary life until ordinary life starts to look less ordinary. She had come back to Derek's side because he had been in an accident. That part was true. She had been there when the ambulance keys cut through the fog of a Wednesday afternoon. She had watched as paramedics lifted him from the road, a bicycle crumpled against the gutter like a discarded toy. He had been white-lipped, eyes darting, trying to make sense of the world. He had been the boy she once loved and the man who, in small bruises and better tempers, had been the place where she learned how to laugh at herself. The doctor's voice in the hospital had been precise and clipped. He may not regain full mobility. The sentence hung like a prophecy, heavy with possibility. For days she slept in the chair by his bed, nursing a mug of hospital tea until the flavor dissolved into the rhythm of the fluorescent lights. Jan was with her always, like a shadow that had learned to ask permission before entering a room. Jan was proud. Jan believed in second chances as if they were a sort of family heirloom. With her bright eyes and practical hair, she said the things mothers say, half sentences brimming with blunt hope. You'll be a good nurse. He needs someone. You're safe with him. It was that last sentence, more than any doctor's note, that threaded a question through Ashley's mind. Safe. Safe from what? From the sudden predations of an unexpected life? From choices that might make her, once again, feel like a small, breaking person? Before Derek's fall, she had attempted to create a life that did not revolve around him. She had dated Andrew Short. Bright encounters that felt like flash photography. Andre was everything Jan warned about, generous, magnetic, and a little too convinced of his own role as savior. He paid dinners without blinking and adored the way Ashley hesitated before taking something expensive, the way she twisted her hair around a finger when she was nervous. He was the kind of man who gave easily because it allowed him to buy intimacy, to buy attention, to keep people close with neat, excessive gestures. Jan did not approve. Jan had made her disapproval a quiet thing. It was whispered into Ashley's ear at odd moments, an ancestral counsel from a woman who had loved and lost and learned the arithmetic of heartache. Andre was generous, Jan said, like a man who was trying to make up for something. Men who overgave, she believed, tended to ask later. You don't want to be his later, she told Ashley once when they were washing dishes at home, the light in the kitchen leaning warm against the tiles. You deserve to be his now. Ashley tried to be objective about Andre. He had made her laugh with an easy cadence and swept her into spaces that smelled of new money and freewheeling plans. But there were fissures. Andre dated Danielle also, it turned out, because he liked being in the position of someone everyone wanted. The thing about people like Andre was how easily their charm doubled as camouflage. When Ashley saw Andre and Danny in his apartment, lips locked in a careless, bright kiss, the calm inside her folded inward like paper crushed in a fist. It was the kind of betrayal that did not draw her. It was a calm, insistent flooding, a steady washing away of trust. Danny's grief after Chelsea's disappearance had been something else entirely. Chelsea had been the kind of friend who carried warmth like a lantern. Her absence hollowed their group, and Danny's need public, immediate had become a mantle that Andre slipped into as if to say, see, I comfort when others cannot. Danny's trembling and searching needed people who could anchor her, and Andre stepped into that role without thinking about who he might be breaking in the process. Ashley watched from the periphery as Andre soothed Danny, as though he had a natural right to do it. She watched, and the sight of them together was less unbearable than the memory of Derek training hard in the rehabilitation center, sweat beading at his temples, his jaw clenched with a kind of stubbornness that frightened her. That stubbornness bent against the doctor's warnings. No heavy exertion, the doctor said, gentle and immovable. You're risking a setback if you push too hard. Derek ignored it. He threw himself into routines like a man trying to outrun a verdict. Every time she saw him raise his knees higher, bend his body in a way that made his muscles tremble. She felt a small, vertical panic. What if he broke? What would she do then? Who would she become? Jan's eyes for Derek were something else to watch. When she looked at him, it was not the affectionate warmth of a friend but the almost relieved glow of someone who had watched a plan take shape. She spoke of safety and steadiness as if romance and practical shelter were the same thing. "You know how I worry," she told Ashley once, a thread of steel in her voice. "I don't want you to be the kind of woman who gets pulled around." There was an intensity in Jan's care for Derek that made Ashley's skin prickly, closeness that was not quite maternal, not quite something else. Derek was undeniably kind in the way of the earnest. He had a way of apologizing before mistakes happened, as if he could sense the edges of pain before they cut. Rumors began to sharpen into insinuations. The staff at the rehab center glanced too long at Derek when he thought they were not looking. There were whispers about insurance, about discrepancies in medical reports and the tuition of care. Ashley, for all her suspicion, wanted something else. Certainty. She wanted to be the kind of person who could know and respond. But life had given her mystery instead. And mystery becomes corrosive when it eats at what you think is true. When she asked Derek directly, when nights pooled into conversations that moved like water over stones, he deflected with a soft, mollifying humor. "You always had a nose for drama," he told her, hands folded like a contrition. "You think everyone's making a movie." He would laugh in a way that felt human and utterly theatrical at once. She wanted to believe him. There is a kind of cruelty in wanting to believe someone who lies so gently. Jan's role in all of it grew into a figure of looming shapes. She liked Derek. That was not a surprise. People like to speak affectionately of people who make their children safe. But what purpose could possess a mother to collude in holding another person's life like bait? There were, undeniably, moments when Jan had leaned into the possibility of reunion with a kind of hunger one might expect at a woman who feared the loss of her child to a fanciful romance. "Maybe you always were his," Jan said to Ashley one afternoon as they folded laundry, the linen cool and domestic between them. "Sometimes a man needs someone who knows him." Her voice sounded like negotiation, like a woman arranging a bookshelf by color. It could have been that Jan simply wanted her daughter secure, that the worry of the world had produced this perhaps errant kindness. Mothers conspire in many ways to protect their children. But Jan's eyes when she looked at Derek told another story, not about protection but about a secret preference. About a pride in the idea of her daughter fitting into a neat pattern. She spoke of Derek as if he had the shape of a cradle. That language can sound like love, can sound like a bomb, but it also carries a pressure. Did Jan prefer the safe map over Ashley's messy, original cartography? Meanwhile, Andre's life unspooled in ways that made Ashley feel a small, helpless kinship with the past. Andre was not a villain, and he was not a saint. He simply was. Which is often the more dangerous thing. He wanted to be admired and feared very little. He wanted to be the one who could dear in and make everything bright and simple. When Chelsea disappeared, the world tilted for a while into a new axis of fear. People's priorities changed. Danny's grief became Andre's invitation to show his soft side. "She needs me right now," he told Ashley, as if the claim alone could justify all the other omissions. He was sincere in parts. But the sincerity dissolved into convenience when Danny, who had worn grief like a raw stone, was offered a shoulder by Andre and seemed to accept his companionship as a measure of relief. And then there were the nights Derek was up late, practicing, the pain of his hands clenching and releasing, sweat at the back of his neck. He would call Ashley from the living room, voice thick with effort, and ask her to fetch him a certain book, to lay a patch over the knee, to hold his hand through 10 repetitions of a movement he insisted would work miracles. There was heroism in that insistence, but it smelled faintly of theater. She watched him flinch when Jan left the room and watched the way his fingers moved when he thought no one was watching, a niche of motion that made the bandages seem like costume. Once, she found a small strip of adhesive on the underside of his sleeve, a careless remnant that could be explained by anything, an old bandage. Tape from a repair. It did not explain much, but it did something else. It taught her the nature of things that cannot be explained. She began to keep a private ledger in her head, Times Derek slept with the light on, times he went out at night, times Jan called him and used a voice softened to honey. She made comparisons between what she was told and what she saw, and the differences felt like gaps in a tooth that would not stop aching. She wanted to ask the right question to the right person at the right time, but that perfect calculus never arrived. Instead, life moved in small, imperfect increments. She walked with him to therapy and watched him grimace and push forward. She sat at the edge of his bed and sang to him the songs that had once fit between them like hand-sized keys. Hope is an iron thing. It holds fast even when the rest of the world makes less sense. The rumor outside the house gathered shape. People at work asked about Derek like they were checking on a neighbor they vaguely cared for. Friends posed questions like tests to see if she was honest. One evening, late, where the city was a firmer sound on the other side of the windows, Ashley opened her laptop and found a message that wavered on the screen like a moth. No subject, no greeting, just a photo. In the image, Derek stood on the sidewalk near a lamppost on the other side of town, laughing with a man whose face was half in shadow. Derek's jacket was slung casually, his hat tilted. His leg was not slung in a cast. He leaned like a man who had only recently learned to stand without thinking about gravity. The message could have been a mistake. It could have been a cruel joke. For a minute she sat in silence, the picture a sharp stone in her chest. Then she stood and walked into the corridor where Derek slept. The house held its breath. Jan turned at the sound of her movement, the kitchen light a small, steady thing behind her. "What's wrong?" she asked. Her voice was the softest of inquiries, laced with something like concern. Ashley showed her the image. For a moment Jan's face was a flat plane of nothing. Then she smiled. The smile was the kind that rearranged furniture. It pushed things into different rooms. "It's nothing," she said. "Derek needs to be seen in public sometimes. He's part of life." Her insistence felt like a gentle closing to a door whose hinges had been oiled with intention. Ashley wanted to believe her. She wanted to say, "It's fine." People are complicated. But something inside her had already stepped across a line. She noticed that the cane by the door was positioned to hide a small indentation on the floor she had not noticed before, a mark that looked as though someone had slid something heavy across the hardwood. She noticed the way Derek's shirt sometimes carried the faint smell of cologne she did not recognize. She noticed how Jan left receipts in her absent things zone for a taxi taken at midnight to an address Ashley did not know. Her hands trembled as she turned once more to the photo on her phone, the image of Derek laughing against lamplight, and she could not tell if what she felt was betrayal or the clean, bright indignation of a person who had been used as the axis of someone else's plan. It would have been merciful if the world had offered a single villain, a point to place the blame. But people are rarely neatly villainous. Andre had faults. Derek was holding his breath for reasons she could not yet fathom. Jan was as much a parent of wants as she was of cautions. The truth tangled and wove itself into a skein rather than a single rope. Ashley found herself standing at the edge of it all, hands open, not sure whether to pull or to let go. She learned to watch for more than actions. She watched for intention. She learned to read pause show Derek's sentence would wobble when Jan was near, how Jan's voice would drop at the mention of other lovers, how Andre's smile would warp when Danny's grief required him to be something more than a charming bystander. She started to keep a small tally. The nights Derek got up and left the house, nights that he claimed were to catch a breath in the open air, times Jan would call and insist on being present for a therapy session. The tally became an obsession because obsession, unlike suspicion, offers structure. She told herself she would not be a woman who let a plan be pulled over her head like a hood. She would not be the thing people placed around other people's needs. At the edge of the calendar, when the days blurred into one another like poorly labeled pages, she found one more piece of evidence that made the world shift beneath her like poorly stacked stones. She had gone to Derek's apartment to find a book he had promised to lend her. It was a banal errand, and yet the air in that apartment had a charged quietness, like rain before it falls. Jan had gone out to the market. Andre was, as usual, elsewhere. Derek rested on the couch with the blanket pulled to his knees, breathing with a slow, measured rhythm. The television murmured in the corner. When the secret finally spoke, It did so with its own quiet cruelty, not with the trumpet of revelation but with the small, intimate violence of confession. The details at first were like spilled beads across a kitchen table, each aspect catching the light: Jan's reasons, Derek's motives, the map of quiet arrangements that had been made not to protect her but perhaps to anchor her. The truth was not monstrous at its edges, but it was rounded with human error, fear and love misapplied, desperation dressed as generosity. Derek had, quite simply, not been entirely truthful about the nature of his accident. It had been real, certainly a fracture, an abrasion, but the severity had been exaggerated in the telling, augmented in a way that allowed him to stay in a contained state of dependence. There were reasons that he gave at first: fears of loneliness, a radical panic that he would be forgotten if he could not demand someone else's presence. He confessed that he had over-dramatized his symptoms because the world had once left him in the margins and he wanted this time to be remembered. He spoke of nights where his chest had been so tight he could not breathe unless someone was near. It was a aching confession, and there was a truth to it. But truth stacked with fabrication is still a falsehood. What cut deeper was the stitch that joined Jan to the project. Jan had been the scaffolding, the one who believed that attachment could be curated like a set. She had lent her weight not out of a simple desire to see her daughter safe but out of a more troubling hope that Ashley might be guided into a life that Jan felt would preserve her. Jan's reasons were written as if fear and prudence were the same. She feared for Ashley as mothers often fear for children. And then she prescribed a solution, and then the prescription looked like a plan. Jan did not start the deception because she wanted Derek for herself. She began it because she wanted Ashley to be sheltered, because the world looked harsher now and she imagined a life where her daughter could be anchored to someone steady. She liked Derek. She liked him a great deal. In her mind, she had done the arithmetic: measure a woman's life into safe variables, subtract the dangers of reckless love, add a dependable partner. The plan, she thought, was kindness. To hear that explanation was to feel stabbed from both sides. On one hand there was the soft, painful truth that Jan had been acting from fear and love. On the other hand, there was the reality that she had taken Ashley's agency like a commodity and rearranged it on a table. There are forms of love that are protective and forms that are possessive. The possession is a quieter sin but is often just as sharp. Ashley's first response was the crude, human one: anger. She felt it like heat flooding her face. How dare they? How dare they think they could take her life and fold it into a fold of convenience? The house itself seemed to rear up with the insult: the way Derek had walked out at night, the photograph she had been sent, the receipts that led to places she had not wanted to go. It was as if their entire life had been a trap softened with couscous and gentle words. When she confronted Derek he lowered his head in a way that made him look smaller than the man she had loved, like a sculpture been wound down. "I didn't think about the hurt," he said. "I thought about needing someone." He looked genuinely ashamed, and the shame was almost enough to make her pity him. Pity is a dangerous emotion because it tends to make the flawed person more appealing. She had to fight the soft of it. "You manufactured my compassion," she said. "You made me a character in your need." Derek tried to explain the night he stood under the lamp post, the photograph that had started the slow burn of suspicion. He had been with an old friend, he said. Someone who had come into town and wanted to catch up. The picture had been snapped casually, a moment captured while he took off to get air. It should have been a mundane truth, but it was a truth that arrived late. Trust, once frayed, hears everything as a possible lie. Jan, who had once folded towels on Ashley's bed and called her darling, tried to meet her in the middle. "I'm sorry," she said. And it was a real apology. She spoke of fear and bitterness at the world and of wanting to teach Ashley how to keep herself safe. "I did what I thought would help," she said. "I thought if you saw him vulnerable, you would stay." The sentence held both devotion and strategy. It smelled like an offer wrapped in good intentions. Ashley listened, and because she was human and exhausted, there were moments where the defense leaked into acceptance. People who hurt us often do so with soft tools. That softening is a hazard. She allowed herself to imagine they had not meant to be unkind, that they had been clumsy in their attempt to secure someone's life. But she also felt the friction, a hard, decisive part of herself that knew that protection must mean respect first. Andre's role, once revealed, complicated matters further. He had, as people like him often do, been playing more than one character. He had wanted the rush of attention, the feeling of being needed and visible, and so he had sat with Danny and offered support. He had also been careless in his fidelity. But the truth was not exactly that Andre had been a monster. He had been human, broken in comfortable places. He had not set out to hurt Ashley. He had set out to be useful to someone in need. Which, again, is an effect of the same hubris that had led Derek and Jen to contrive Care, the idea that one can purchase another's tender as if it is an item on a menu. Chelsea's case, the kidnapping, unfurled in the background like a second narrative, one that made everyone more raw. When Chelsea was finally found, a rescue, a messy miracle involving police and clues and a kind of luck that felt like sin. Ashley thought the world might regain a sense of rightness. Chelsea's return was not the resolution they had imagined. The event revealed the fragility of the community and the desperate lengths people would go to comfort one another in the aftermath. Andre's support for Danny, once a morally ambiguous comfort, now seemed like a necessary balm. The ethics of consolation are not always clear in a world where pain is a currency. The public reaction to the revelation of Derek's secret was predictably messy. People loved scandal and had opinions about who deserved blame. Some took Ashley's side, calling Derek manipulative. Others said Jen had only been a mother, doing what mothers sometimes do. Others still took Derek's side, saying a man struggling with fear and loneliness deserved grace. The world is generous with judgments until the person is someone you love, and then suddenly nuance returned like a loyal dog. What mattered most in the stuttering aftermath, though, was the personal arithmetic that each of them had to perform. Ashley had to count her losses and see if love was an enough currency to pay for the betrayal. Derek had to reconcile his need for Care with the reality that he had asked for it in a way that denied Ashley her right to choose. Jen had to own the fact that she had thought she was protecting her daughter by arranging her life like a map, and that maps sometimes erase the contours of a person's freedom. They argued, then, in a way that felt like unfastening stitches. The conversation was raw, full of things said in immediate reproof. "You manipulated me," Ashley told Derek in a voice that could not hold the tremor in it. "You made my love a job you could assign." He apologized with the broken earnestness of a man who had mismeasured himself. He said, "I thought you would stay if I were weak." He said it like a confession, as though those 5 words were the entire myth. Ashley thought about all the times she had stayed. She thought about the nights she had held Derek's hand while he slept, the strings of small mercies she had offered. She thought about the moment she had watched the photograph on her phone and felt the world tilt, and the way Jan had smiled like a woman who is arranging decorations. The aftermath required choices. Andre faced the slant of gossip but also the forgiveness of people who needed him to be kind. Derek faced the harder work, to show he would not repeat the same mistake. He had to ask for forgiveness and accept that forgiveness might be withheld. Ashley had to decide whether to stay in a life that had been curated without her consent or to remove herself from a plan that had been laid by other hands. She had to decide what it meant to trust someone again. She had to decide whether the love she felt, old, sticky, complicated, could survive the knowledge that it had been orchestrated. That night, Ashley did not sleep. She thought about leaving in the quiet geometry of her room, about the possibility of choosing a life where people asked before they acted, where her heart did not become raw material. She thought about the ways people have of bending love into blueprints and of the fragile arrogance of trying to calculate another person's happiness for them. In the morning, when January's light peeled open the curtains, Derek came to her with a small, tremulous plan. He wanted them to rebuild. He said he wanted counseling and transparency and a life measured not in carefully placed events but in open chapters. He offered details, weekly sessions, full medical disclosures, a vow to stop the secretive tending that had once been his refuge. Jan, for her part, offered a different thing, regret and a promise to start over in the way mothers attempt to right wrongs. Andre apologized to Danny, who accepted with the slow dignity of someone who had lost a piece of herself and decided to gather it back as she could. Ashley felt the earth tilt under the weight of the choices. To accept meant to try again with the people who had misled her. To refuse meant to walk away from comfort and risk the edges of loneliness. She stood on a threshold like a character in a play, an awful kind of spotlight on her face, and realized that whatever she chose would change the shape of the house she returned to. She thought about Chelsea's rescue, about the way the community had come together, and she thought about the paradox of wanting both shelter and autonomy. She wanted to be neither a caretaker of someone else's need nor a person entirely closed off to affection. The world had handed her a cruel kind of calculus: choose between being needed and having the right to choose. She had to find a third path, she thought, or she would be back at the same table, eating the same soft lies. Finally, she made a choice that cost her the kind of brave ordinary thing: she asked for time. It was not an evil decision. Time is often the best tool for discerning the truth, but it was not a simple withholding. Derek, Jan, Andre, Dan, each of them had to sit in the space where consequences met actions and decide what they would be accountable for. It was an act of refusal and demand at once. She would not be an instrument to be tuned. If they wanted her, they would have to ask without trickery. If they wanted Derek to heal, they had to learn how to do it in the open. That requirement, humble and severe, changed the tenor of their relationships. It demanded honesty, and honesty has a way of clearing rooms and making new ones. Derek agreed and began, with monstrous awkwardness and real willingness, to follow through on his promises. Jan, pained and complicated, worked at her own undoing, trying to learn the difference between protection and possession. Andre and Danny navigated their own fractured terrain, recognizing that comfort cannot always be purchased with charm. Months passed. Rehabilitation slowly made Derek stronger, not as a miracle but as a series of small, painful victories. Ashley learned the contours of a life that had both compromise and prevision. People committed to new rules, openness, therapy, and an agreement that no one would ever again stage an accident to keep someone in place. It was not perfect. Healing is not a linear narrative. There were days Derek slipped back into old habits of secrecy, a closed door, a phone call he would not share. Once, Ashley found another photograph like the ones that had started the storm, and for a dizzying, furious minute the old fear returned. But this time they spoke about it. Derek did not hide. He apologized and, small as it might seem, that act of facing the wound when it reopened built something like trust.